Hello and welcome to an analysis of why Johann Sebastian Bach is objectively the best composer of all time. And yes, I did say objectively, not subjectively. And quick disclaimer on that. That I love listening to Bach's music is subjective, because it is taste. If you don't care for Bach's music, even if I can't understand that, then that is also subjective. However, Bach's influence on the history of Western music compared to that of any other classical composer is unmatched. And that is an objective fact. And that is what I will be examining today. Because as they say, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. So sit back as I serve up for you some extraordinary evidence on an extraordinary composer. Just a preface, all research, scripting, and the Digication-ePortfolio were done and created for the sake of this project by Jon Javor for Honors Seminar English 199, Walking Dictionaries, Section HAK, using Screencast-o-Matic, Google NGrams, Encyclopedia Britannica, Digication, and Noodletools Express for citation. Now that that's out of the way, we will first examine a Google Ngram plot of Bach as compared to other composers, namely Beethoven, Mozart, and Brahms. What Google Ngrams does, in case one is unaware, is examine the prevalence of reference to Bach in written works, and compare it to that prevalence, that is, how often they appear, of other composers. As one can see, all of these Germanic composers experienced an increase in popularity during and after the Second World War, when the Nazi Party in Germany elevated these and other German composers, such as Wagner, to be nationalist icons. And over here in the Corpus English, this was observed shortly after, and written about. As one can see, the only composer that can actually compete with Bach is Beethoven. But not all of the times Beethoven is referenced to are positive. During the most significant spike in the late 40s and early 50s, there in fact came about an expression, roll over Beethoven, to express the rise of rock and roll over the classical era. Certainly not a positive reference. And in 1956, Chuck Berry recorded his hit single Roll Over Beethoven, which was popular enough to boost Beethoven over Bach, for sure. It was not only covered by the Beatles, increasing its popularity more, but it was also voted by Rolling Stone magazine one of the 500 greatest songs of all time. Additionally, what else might explain the prevalence of Beethoven over Bach? We will fall back to the Nazi Party and its control over Germany, when famous cellist Pau Casals openly refused to perform the Bach cello suites, which he had discovered himself when he was a boy in the thrift shop in Barcelona, for the Nazi Party, which he opposed. The famous Catalan cellist was put under house arrest as a result of his defiance to the party. But it also may be part of the reason why Beethoven was premiered. Not to mention that Beethoven was a more recent composer than Bach, and still somewhat more well-known because of it. Now, there is one last date to be noted, which is around this time, when Bach first began to rise out of obscurity and into the public eye of music. The event that transpired here was Mendelssohn's conducting and performance of Bach's St. Matthew Passion, considered by musicologists to be one of the greatest works of music of all time, that brought Bach out of obscurity and back into the listener's ear, after nearly 3/4 of a century in the dark. Next, using Digication, a presentation has been prepared in the form of a web page and a series of them that continue to provide evidence for Bach's musical superiority. And the first that will be examined is an engraving, published in a prominent 1799 Journal of Music, created for it by music theorist and a composer himself, Augustus Friedrich Christopher Kuhlmann, which depicts J.S. Bach, right here, at the center of the sun that's represented, whose profound musical genius fuels the rays radiating out from him. Mozart can be seen, as can Handel and Joseph Haydn. It was, of course, just before Beethoven's time. However, This engraving essentially puts all other composers before and slightly after him under Bach. Even back as far as 1799, Bach was considered the source of all musical greatness, the life-giving sunlight without which other composers could not hope to germinate. Now, on the subject of composers, it would be negligent not to examine what the fellows in Bach's profession, the best, had to say about his influence on them. Ludwig van Beethoven said himself that his name should be Ocean, not Bach. To explain briefly for those of you who don't know German, this is essentially a play on words. Bach's last name means brook or creek or small river, and Beethoven is essentially saying here that Bach is so profound, his influence so widespread and deep his music is, that his name should instead be Ocean. He himself said of Bach that Bach was the immortal god of harmony, which is high praise. Fellow composer, classical in nature, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, is said to have sprung out of his chair upon hearing Bach and exclaimed, "Now here's something one can learn from." And it's to be kept in mind that Mozart himself was a child prodigy in every sense of the word, and yet Bach could still teach him. As Mozart said, Bach is the father, we are the boys. All of us who are capable to do something serious have learned it from him. But truly, I believe that the words of Brahms can sum up best the composer's sentiments in general on Bach's influence when he stated, simply and effectively, "Study Bach. There you will find everything." And as if that were not enough, encyclopedia writers, whose pursuit, like dictionary writers, except Bach is in no dictionary, being as he is a proper noun, is none other than unbiased reality and the objective conveyance of truth. And here is what they wrote on Bach in a very well-known encyclopedia, Encyclopedia Britannica. As far back as the 9th edition, 1878, they wrote, "It is thus that Bach has vivified the rigid forms of the fugue with the fire of individual passion. His style and his gene neglected by his contemporaries, starting from a different basis and imbued with a different spirit, have ultimately been destined to exercise a potent spell on modern art." By Marx, the Karl Marx, a well-known critical writer. He has been called the founder and father of German music. And this estimation has not changed over time. The 15th edition of Encyclopedia Britannica, 2007 publication, stated simply, "Johann Sebastian Bach is now generally regarded as one of the greatest composers of all time. Bach was able to survey and bring together the principal styles, forms, and national traditions that had developed during preceding generations, and by virtue of his synthesis, enriched them all. Bach exercised a profound and acknowledged influence directly on Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven." Bach is the very definition of the ideal composer, according to Encyclopedia Britannica. But what does Bach himself have to say of his tremendous influence, of his limitless talent as both a composer and a musician? He says, "It's easy to play any musical instrument. All you have to do is touch the right key at the right time, and the instrument will play itself," says an accomplished organist. But mostly, what comes foremost about Bach is this quote that embodies his philosophy. "I worked hard. Anyone who works as hard as I did can achieve the same results." An inspiring and uplifting thought, to be sure. And I suppose we will all have to just keep trying. That is the end of the presentation, and thank you so much for watching. I hope that you were convinced, but if not, I could always come back and try it again.